Well, a very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Cunard Insights lecture programs, and lovely to see you all here this morning for another fascinating and entertaining lecture. I would just like to mention that Malcolm will be doing a book signing following the talk this morning, and that will be held on deck 3, just outside the bookshop, midships by the B elevator, so on deck 3 outside the bookshop. So that will follow the talk today. Now, today's talk, of course, in Malcolm's 40 years as a customs officer, he would have come across a lot of different scams and ways that people dream up to conceal contraband and drugs. So today's talk will be concentrating on swallowers. Ladies and gentlemen, Malcolm Nelson.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. Thank you. Lovely. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. Very gratifying, I must say. I've said to you, please ask me questions if you see me around the ship, and I'll bring them to this forum before I start. And so just a couple of things before I kick off today. It's funny, so many of these questions seem to happen in the gents' toilets. And of course, I can't write them down, so, you know, if I've forgotten anybody's, I'm ever so sorry. Firstly, I'm very often asked, are the dogs addicted to the drugs that they're trying to find? And they're not. I can't go, it's a whole full talk on how they train the dogs. Quite simply, they're like all other dogs. They're addicted to being told they're a good boy or a good girl and being made a fuss of. It's as simple as that. I'm also, I'll just put this up here. I often get asked, in fact, I've been asked twice on this cruise already, why don't we just X-ray everything? Just X-ray it all and we'll see the drugs. Well, this is an X-ray of an empty suitcase that has got drugs in the lining. And you can see the drugs there. Those brown patches there are the drugs. All this other brown stuff around the outside is cardboard or whatever. When you look at a suitcase, this is an empty suitcase, by the way. When you look at a full suitcase, all you see is a mass of brown, because everything that starts life as something that grows, which most drugs do, obviously not the synthetic ones, but most drugs, comes up brown. So you get a mass of brown because all your clothes and everything come up brown. So the X-rays aren't actually a lot of use until we actually have emptied the suitcase. Thirdly, two people have asked me this. I've got a feeling they might be on the same table at dinner, but they both were surprised that Cortez, the man in the first talk, the Bolivian gentleman who we allowed to run, and I talked about the fact that the cash dogs had found him with 20,000, the equivalent of 20,000 pounds in his suitcase. They all said, wasn't that a small amount? It was on the smallish side, actually, but just to give you an idea of the sort of amounts that sometimes we're dealing with, I was a tarmac officer at the time, and I'm sitting in the tarmac office. We're going on to search, me and my oppo, we're going to go and search a plane that's due down in about 20 minutes. And we just sat there reading the paper or something. And the squawk box goes from the tower, and it tells us that a Cessna aircraft, Golf Alpha Lima Yankee Charlie.
This is the bridge.
Oh, thank you.
Attention, medical response team, medical response team. Queen's room, midships, deck 2. This is the bridge. Attention, medical response team, medical response team. Location, Queen's room, deck 2, midships.
Okay. Okay? Am I back on? Yeah, good. Okay. So we are sat there. The squawk box goes. This particular aircraft has filed a flight plan for Deauville. It's just come in from Blackbush, which is a small airport just outside of Heathrow. And we have to give it permission because it's an unscheduled flight. We have a quick look at our database. It's a sort of suspect list that's hanging up on the wall. And we actually want to talk to Golf Alpha Lima Yankee Charlie over something to do with paperwork. Nothing suspicious. So we say no, they can't go, tell them to abort and send them back to the general aviation terminal, and we'll go out there and meet them, which we do. We drive over to the other side of the airport. We're getting there just as Golf Alpha Lima Yankee Charlie is taxiing up. My oppo Neil is parking. I go to the aircraft. I open the door, And a Cessna is probably about as big as from here to the end of the stage. And the cockpit area is probably 8-10 feet long. I open the door, and there's the pilot in there looking over his shoulder at me, looking a little bit worried. He's got a vacuum thermos flask, which he's got coffee in. He's got a Tupperware box with cheese and ham sandwiches. But apart from him, his dashboard, and these two items, all I can see is money. It is completely full of money. And it's not in brown paper parcels. You know, I can see it's money. It's done up with elastic bands, and it's 20s, 10s, £5 notes. Absolutely full of money. £2.8 million stuffed in this cockpit. Do you know, you get ridiculous thoughts at times, don't you? Normally, unfortunately, when you're in church or somewhere, but all I could think was, I mean, I didn't know it was 2.8 million at this point, but all I could think was, you've got all this money, you're going to Deauville, and you've brought a thermos flask and cheese and ham sandwiches. I could not get that out of my mind. He absolutely amazed me a little bit later on, because he was denying all knowledge of it, of course. He knew... No, he'd just been asked to take a cargo by this man, and it was nothing to do with him, and et cetera, et cetera. So during the interview, you try and sort of inveigle them into some admission that they were involved. So at one point, I've said to him, wouldn't it have been a lot easier if it had been £50 notes? He looked at me with that sort of pitying look, and he said, nah. He says, you never trust anyone with £50 notes. No. Not like you trust a complete stranger with £2.8 million, yeah. The very strange thing about that was, apart from him losing the money, because he said it was nothing to do with him, the only offence we could do him under at the time, there was no proceeds of crime at the time, was exchange control. So it was, yeah, so we do get bigger amounts, yeah. Okay, today's talk is about internal concealments. It's a little bit more serious than some of the other subjects I've been talking about, in that it is a particularly nasty crime and a particularly sad crime on occasions. I'm going to try and give you an insight into what we're looking for, what the packages look like, how we deal with the people once we've actually caught them. It was the 3rd of April in 1973. Two officers by the name of Chris Isaacs and David Warren were on a newly formed baggage team, and that was a team that had a license to roam throughout the airport. We are at Heathrow Airport again, by the way. Dave and Chris are in the Green Channel in Terminal 3, and the Syrian Arab flight is coming through from Damascus. This is the cheapest way of getting from the Far East, the subcontinent of India, back to England, is to come via Damascus at that time. They stop a man, one of them stops a man, called Victor Reginald White. They are suspicious about him. He's been out to Nepal and he's been backpacking. And they suspect he's going to have a small amount of personal heroin or maybe cannabis resin. That's what they're expecting to find. But it doesn't pan out quite as they expect. He's got that sort of calm that we have to start with. But then he comes into a sort of body language, what we later on called secondary body language, and which, again, I will be touching on later, which unnerves them, unsettles them. They're not sure what they're dealing with. They've done his baggage, which isn't much. They've rubbed him down, strip-searched him, nothing. But they take him into an interview room. And they are questioning him about his movements, and they are questioning him about exactly what he did, who he was with, where he lives, etc., what his plans are, all that sort of thing. They're just picking away, really. He suddenly tells them that he needs to use the toilet. Now, they take him to use the toilet. He needs to actually use the toilet, not just the urinal. In those days, we didn't have separate toilets for passengers or offenders. They used ours. So he is allowed, he's rubbed down again. He's allowed to go to the toilet. The door is actually shut on him, and he goes to the toilet. Comes out, he's fine. They go back into the interview room. A short while later, he needs to go to the toilet again. Now, they're not suspicious of anything, bearing in mind where he's coming from. In Nepal, a lot of people come back with dodgy stomachs. But they are a little bit wary now, because they're two good officers. So they take him to the toilet again, and they put him in the cubicle, but they leave the door open. And they watch him. Not too closely, but they're just watching to make sure he's not doing anything untoward other than going to the toilet. He goes to the toilet, he flushes the toilet, he leaves. For whatever reason, and Dave could never really explain it, Dave goes back and checks the toilet cubicle, even though he's seen him use it. When he looks down the toilet, there's a lot of little packages floating around. We have got our first swallower, 3rd of April, 1973. We have not seen swallowers before. At first, we still are not sure that we've got a problem with it, an issue. But a few months later, 3 months later in actual fact, 2 officers by the names of Brian Davis and Peter Lawley. Peter Lawley will later on in his career become famous or infamous for being the officer responsible for those 2 girls, Smith and Cahill. You may remember their names. They were caught eventually by the Thai authorities and put in what they call the Bangkok Hilton. John Major, after pressure from all of the press, not just the tabloids, got them a free pardon. Peter Lawley was the officer responsible for that, from a tip-off he got from a KLM check-in girl. But Lawley and Davis are in the Green Channel. They're on one of these newly formed baggage teams as well. They stop a man called Wimberley. He's coming from the subcontinent via Damascus. It's a very similar scenario. Again, very calm to start with. Then the secondary body language isn't what we expect. They hold him, and they actually hold him overnight. He's got no fixed abode, so they decide to give him somewhere to sleep for the night. And he doesn't object. Maybe because he feels if he does object, it's going to look suspicious. They lock him in the interview room, because we didn't have cells in those days. It was just an interview room, but we were used to keeping people overnight, so we had these mattresses, and we used to give them mattresses and sleeping bags. And they leave him. But the next day, when they go and open the door to the room, the smell is incredible. Well, disgusting, is perhaps a better word. And Wimberley is sitting there trying to look very, very nonchalant. But when they look, there's little sinks in these rooms. We would never have those later. You know, that sort of thing would be removed. We weren't used to dealing with people like this. And what Wimberley had been doing during the night, he'd been passing the packages that he was carrying, and he'd been trying to flush them away down the sink, but he hadn't succeeded. We now knew that we had a whole new problem. This was round about the time of Leroy Winston Montereau, the man from my last talk. A whole new ball game. It was almost like a phony war up until then. I'll just show you. I always think this sort of sums it up. It wasn't the end, not even the beginning of the end, but it certainly for us in the war on drugs was the end of the beginning. At its peak, that war on drugs, we would at Heathrow, between us and Gatwick, we would have 730 swallowers in 1 year. Those are the ones we caught. Those swallowers would carry on average 350 packages. Those packages would weigh between 1/2 and 3/4 of a kilo of normally cocaine or heroin. But in actual fact, Wimberley and White they both had cannabis resin inside them. During the worst year, or depending on how you look at it, I suppose, but during that year when we had 730 people, 3 of those people died because of the packages unraveling inside them. Just how many people's lives we saved, I'll go into a little bit later. The packages could be almost anything, and I will show you pictures of those later. But we now knew we were into a whole new ball game, and it really was a wake-up call for customs. We had to go from being amateurs to professionals virtually overnight. And I have to say, I feel we did. But then I would say that, wouldn't I? So how do we do it? Let's have a look. How do we find them? People have said to me, you know, how do you find them? Because when you stop other people, you've got the drugs. But with these people, you haven't got the drugs. You just think they're inside them. So how do you find them? Well, we use a lot of the same methods that I spoke about during my first talk. We use profiles. And they're very much more distinct with swallowers. They're very much more specific. The people are normally poor scraps of humanity, very desperate people. They're people from the jungles of Colombia. They may be doing it to get a well for the village, or maybe to pay for a teacher for a year. Or they're from the slums of Accra or Kingston, Jamaica, or from the little villages in Pakistan. They're normally very desperate people. The profiles, though, vary wildly. If I give you a profile of a swallower coming from Colombia, as I've said, they're going to be recruited from the jungles. They're normally male from Colombia. They will be traveling on their own. They might have a minder with them, but they won't actually be linked visually. The giveaway with them is that they're from the jungles. They've been dressed in clothes that would be appropriate for a flight, but they're not comfortable in those clothes because they're not used to wearing them. They're not used to wearing proper shoes. They're used to wearing flip-flops or no shoes at all. They're not used to wearing jackets. They're not used to wearing anything that we would just take as normal. On one occasion, I'm in the Green Channel in Terminal 4. The Bogota flight is coming through, and we're all looking and we're all looking. Suddenly, somebody shouts out, "There's a shoe in the green." So we look down, and sure enough, there's a shoe, just a shoe, sitting in the middle of the Green Channel. Now, if you can envisage it, 1 minute we're all stood up like I am now, looking at head height. The next minute, we're all on our hands and knees, looking under the benches, trying to see where our own little Cinderella is with just one shoe on. And quite simply what had happened, when we did get him, he was stopped just as he left the channels. His other shoe was tied so loosely that he had literally walked out of that shoe because he wasn't used to actually wearing shoes. And he had them tied so loosely that he'd literally just walked out of it. If we go right across the world, to the other side of the world, to Pakistan, for a long time we didn't think we had swallows from Pakistan. We thought that maybe the length of the journey was prohibitive, that it was too dangerous for people to carry them. And then one day I was the Alpha One, the fat controller that I mentioned the other day. It's a Sunday evening. These sort of things always seem to happen on a Sunday evening when there was nobody else around to help you. And I get a phone call from Barkingside Police Station, Barkingside in East London. They always phoned Heathrow because they always knew they would get a response. To say that they'd got the body of an elderly Asian lady. It was a naked body and it had been found in a skip. And for whatever reason, they suspected she had died of an overdose of drugs from an internal concealment. I didn't really go into why they believed that, but they were pretty positive, and it turned out they were right. Could I send 2 officers along to actually attend the post-mortem to retrieve the packages? Which we did. And the lady was a Pakistani national who had recently returned from Pakistan, where she'd been on a family visit. We very quickly had a whole succession of bodies from that part of London, Barkingside, East Ham, Stratford, Plaistow, places like that, all round that neck of the woods. We now had a profile, a very disturbing profile, because with most of the people we had, as I was saying to you the other day, most drug smugglers have no good reason for travel, and that's one of their weaknesses. But these people, these ladies, had genuine reasons for travel. They were going home to visit family, or they were coming over here to visit family, and they were in big family groups, and there was loads and loads of baggage. But we had our profiles, and profiles are really big when it comes to swallowers. We've got the something not quite right. That is, again, is another one. It's just a similar one to that we had in with the normal type of drug smuggling. A little bit more specific. The main indicator here for us would be, again, people traveling on their own, yeah, not looking quite right, but also a real big common denominator is that they would have only overhead baggage. They wouldn't have any checked-in baggage, but they would come through with that main bulk, that 400 or so people. They would come through with them because, yeah, they could have come straight down and picked their bag up. Oh, sorry, just come straight through once they'd come through immigration. But they don't want to stand out like a sore thumb. They've got no checked-in baggage because if nature does decide to take its course, they don't want to be hanging around the belt waiting for a suitcase. And they won't want to discard their suitcases because they know that we love discarded suitcases because there's all sorts of clues in there for us. So they have no checked-in baggage, but they come in. So you're looking at a great big crowd of people coming through, that 400 rushing through in 20 or so minutes, and you see somebody with what is obviously overhead baggage, and you wonder why. So there's something not quite right. The body language will come in just a moment. Information, of course. Incredible amount of information. Actually, I'll just link these two together, information and the dogs. We've got a nice picture of Bruno again here. He was really one of my favourite dogs. We'd get a lot of information. Normally, it was numerical information to say that expect so many drug swallowers on a particular flight. On one occasion, I'm Alpha 1 again, and I get information to say that there are going to be 20 plus swallowers on a given flight from Lagos. 20 plus. Now, I'm expecting swallowers, but it gives me a heads up on just how many officers I need to have around. Unfortunately, I haven't got enough. So what I do is I sit everybody down in the gate as they come off the flight. You know, the gate you normally go in to go out. And we run the dog up and down. And it was Bruno. Bruno's a brilliant dog. Bruno's going up and down, typical Springer, as if he hasn't got a care in the world, you know. As you can see, he's not docked, and actually, he doesn't look docked there, but he wasn't. And he's swinging away, and he suddenly stops by this man, boom. And I'm there with my deputy, and I said, as I was telling you the other day, he's got to put his paw on him. I said, Bruno, he's got to put his paw on him. But he doesn't. Our Bruno goes one better. He does what our collie used to do whenever she wanted to walk. He leans forward, and he puts his chin on this man's knee, and he just looks up at him with these great big spaniel eyes. It was so beautiful. Everybody sort of did that. They went, "Ah, isn't that lovely? Yeah, isn't that lovely?" Except one man. He did do a sort of R, but it wasn't a nice R. It wasn't a nice R. But that was a brilliant detection by Bruno. The dogs, this is a question I am asked quite frequently. Can they smell the drugs internally? In actual fact, they can't. They can't actually smell them internally. What Bruno was smelling there was the man had been involved in handling the drugs and the packages as he swallowed them. And we've uncovered this on another occasion when we did a similar exercise and got none. And then when they were coming through the Green Channel, the officers did pull in one or two swallowers. And it was Colombians again. And on this occasion, we got to speak to one of the Colombians who amazingly spoke good English. And that was unusual, because like I say, coming from the jungles. And he told us what had happened, the actual swallowing process. And this was good for us to learn this. And what he told us had happened was he was recruited from a little village, and he was taken off to another little village into a sort of small, it sounded like a small holding, a little farm. He was put in a shed, and he was stripped. Then he was taken to another little shed where there was a couple of chairs and a table. He was sat down, and in walked a man with a tray covered, it was about 340, 50 packages, all balloons. And the man came in with some water and some honey and some jam. And the man we were talking to didn't touch any of the balloons. The man who brought them in fed them to him as if they were oysters. And he kept taking water and taking water. When he'd swallowed all of them, he was now taken to some sort of a shower facility, probably just a hose pipe, and hosed down, then taken back to his clothes and dressed. So he'd had nothing to do with those drugs at all. Because what the dogs did smell, what Bruno was smelling on that particular occasion, was very, very fine particles of dust. That's what he was actually smelling. So these are the reasons we stop people. We actually stop them. But now it's the difficult bit, because now we're suspicious. The primary body language is telling us that there's something up. But we're suspicious, but we're not going to find any drugs, are we? Because they're internal. So this is when it becomes a little bit more difficult. We get a little bit more technical. But the first thing that gives them away at this stage is that they have dreadfully poor stories. They are cannon fodder to the drug organisations. They are prepared to take a hit. They know if they put 20 swallowers on a flight, at the very most, we're going to get 5 or 6 of them. The most I ever remember, on one occasion, we actually arrested 23 people on a single flight with drugs internally. I just can't begin to guess how many there must have actually been on that flight, but 23. So they're very poor stories. I'm going to give you 2 case studies at the end of this talk which will exemplify that. So you're immediately realizing that you're dealing with somebody who's not got a good reason for travel. They're not a normal type of person who would just be jetting around the world. Very often they're illiterate. Very often you're having to bring in interpreters. The stories are full of holes, absolutely full of holes. But the next big thing for us is the body language. And this is what I'm calling the secondary body language, because we get this calm. Yeah, we get this very false calm. I'm not going to act nervous. I'm not going to act guilty. That's what they've been told. Very few swallows are confrontational. You know, you're not going to get, like Catherine Medici the other day, you've only stopped me because I'm black. Very, very rarely. But what tends to happen is, once they realize that calm hasn't worked, is that they become much, much more volatile. You just don't, unpredictable. You just don't quite know what will happen next. And they start asking you questions. And I'm in the Green Channel on one occasion in Terminal 3. A colleague friend of mine, Ian Richardson, has stopped this man. In actual fact, he's coming from San Francisco. It's a bit of a strange routing, but he looks like a backpacker. Ian suspects he's a swallower. He sidles over to me, and just very sotto voce, he says to me, will you just stand in close here a bit, Mal? I got a feeling young chummy here's going to kick off. So I walk over to the bench. Ian's behind the bench, and I'm sort of on the side at the end. The man's got a little cardboard, one of those old D-Mob suitcases. I remember my dad's D-Mob suitcase. Ian does a strange thing at this point, actually. He opens the lid sideways. Now, what you normally do is open the lid towards the person, because that stops them getting their hands in. They've got to lean right across. And because you might want later to get fingerprint evidence, so you don't want them getting their hands in the bag, because they will say, oh, well, I did get my hands in the bag, sort of thing. So, but Ian opens it sideways. We'll never know why. He couldn't explain it. Chummy's hands shoot straight into the suitcase, straight away. He must have been waiting for it. And it goes up to his mouth. Ian, who's a big man, leaps over the bench, spread eagles the man. I leap round the side, and I'm sitting on his legs. And we've got him spread right across the Green Channel. Now, the rest of the team, and this is to cover a point a man brought up with me just prior to this talk. The rest of the team, a couple of them are sort of guarding us, because we're laying in the middle of the Green Channel, and you don't know, do you? There might be a passenger out there with a grievance against Cstoms, and they might think, well, this is too good an opportunity to miss, mightn't they? And they've got a trolley in their hand. So we're being guarded on one side by these 2 officers. The rest of the team, in case this is a distraction, are running around like headless chickens, stopping absolutely anybody who vaguely fits the profile or vaguely doesn't look quite right, or, just anybody, in case this is a diversion. So we're laying there, and I've got to ask you to use your imagination here, because I couldn't get any pictures for this at all. So if you could use your imagination, Ian and I are laying there, and it's catch-22, actually. Ian's got his hand round his throat, so he can't swallow whatever it is he's put in his mouth. And now Ian comes up with a good idea, and he says, I'll tell you what we do, Mal. I'll tell you what we do. I'm going to squeeze his throat a bit tighter. When his mouth pops open, you can stick your hand in and get it out. Ladies and gentlemen, I did exactly what you did. I laughed, because there was no way I was sticking my hand in his throat, because I wasn't going to be getting any brownie points for this. But he did have the germ of an idea. So what we did was, Ian was a big man. He was 6'3", and he was big. And in the end, I sort of got off, and Ian laid over him in such a way that he still couldn't move. I got my hand round his throat. I mean, the way Ian was laying on him, it must have looked like some bizarre sexual riot going on in the middle of the Green Channel with this man wriggling away underneath him, you know. Yeah, I said I couldn't get any pictures, didn't I? So in the end, what we do is I gradually squeeze, I get sort of practice a few times, squeeze his throat a bit. As he opens his mouth a little bit, I'd sort of then squeeze it so he can't shut it again. And eventually we get him like a fish with his mouth stuck open, and Ian puts his hand in and retrieves the package, which had 9 grams of opium inside it. He was a swallower as well. I bring that anecdote up because that is typical of what a swallower might do. That man, if he'd have just kept calm and we'd have found that bit of silver foil with the opium in it, Ian probably would have thought that was what his behaviour was all around. But the secondary body language gave him away. So now we are pretty sure we've got something. We're going to take him into an interview room. We may arrest at this point. We'll only arrest at this point if he sort of demurs from being taken away. Because now what we want to do is we want to use some of this equipment up here. We're going to go for either one of these two to start with. We're going to go for the EMIT machine or the iron scan. EMIT machine, enzyme multi-assay internal tester, EMIT, urine tester. Quite simply, they pass urine, we can test it and see if there's drugs in it. The iron scan we could do without having to take the urine sample. So that's going to be our next port of call. So we're taking them into an interview room. We're not actually putting it on tape yet. It's still in the notebook because we're not into an offence situation. But we do start to question them about their habits. You know, do you use drugs? You know, so do you use drugs? It's the first sort of thing we're going to ask. Oh, no, I don't do drugs. I am a Christian. It's so common. I am a Christian. Okay, Christians apparently don't use drugs. And so then you test them, and it comes up positive. So you've told us you don't use drugs, but now we've got this positive. Are you carrying drugs internally? Oh, well, maybe I did a little bit of coke before I left. You know, so now we're getting a bit of a backtrack. At this point, 9 times out of 10, that will be the point that we actually get the admission. But if they don't, what we then have to do is we have to go on, EMIT, iron scan, we then have to go on to an X-ray. We have to go to Hillingdon or the nearest hospital with which we've got an agreement and actually X-ray the person. And I have to say, I'm not going to say 100%, but because on one occasion it didn't happen, but this is the point where most people will admit that they've got drugs inside them because there's their X-ray completely full. A man called Wilson Rogers, I showed him his X-ray as proof that he'd got drugs inside him, and he denied it was him. He actually looked at me, he said, "You can see that's not me." Okay, you don't give up at that point, but you forget about questioning. So now we've really got the evidence. I think we're going to just look at a few packages before we go on to what we do now. This was a man called Grigg. And apologies again for photographs. I have made those apologies before. We weren't photographers. I took a picture of these because these were incredible, these packages. They were about it's a bit distorted actually. They were about 2/3 the size of my thumb, and they were about the circumference of a 50p piece. And they were hard. I don't know how they look more like the sort of packages that would be stuffed, but he had 405 of them. And that's him. Again, apologies. You can see he was actually crammed through with them, 405 packages. So that's sort of the sort of thing we are looking at. But just to look at them in more detail, that's a very, very typical early type package. That's Wimberley and White had those sort of packages. Very similar. Balloons. This picture, you're going to see, this picture will be the basis of my last talk. When you, hopefully if you turn up, you, the audience, will be the jury. It's a case study, and you'll be the jury and the judge. These are typical balloons from Colombia, but in actual fact, these ones came from Accra. But they're very typical of what we were getting from Colombia. Just normal balloons, simply knotted like you would blow up a balloon and knot it if you were going to hang it up as a decoration. Incredible. Much loved by the swallower because they would contain a little bit of air and make it that much easier to swallow. You know, they're a bit softer, just slide down a little bit easier. But some of the more modern ones, I'll show you some pictures of some of the more modern ones. Now, these ones are all factory packed. And these are just ones that I've taken off of the internet, in actual fact. This is heroin. And So is this. This is more heroin. And this picture is incredible. I told you earlier that the average sort of weight load, payload, between 1/2 and 3/4 of a kilo. This particular load, absolutely incredible. A Nigerian lady traveling from Pakistan to Hong Kong, and I'm pretty sure you can't see it, but down there it shows the weight. That's one lady carrying those, and there's 2.15 kilos of heroin inside her. Absolutely beyond belief. Just to cover the stuffed angle of it as well, those sort of packages don't tend to be used when people are stuffing them rather than swallowing them. They tend to use things within things, hard cases. And the Kinder's egg must have been made for the smuggler who wanted to stuff drugs, because that little bit in the middle of it where you got the little toy, time after time after time we would find drugs in them. Here we are, evidence there of some rocks of crack cocaine, and there we've got another picture. That again was crack cocaine, a package within a package. So that's what we're dealing with. That's what we're looking for. We've got an X-ray. We know they've got them there. We've now got to get those packages out of them. We've got to take them into our cell block. We eventually had our own specially designed cell block for these people. And straight away, we're going to put them in one of these. We're going to put them in a zoot suit. It's white. It's paper. We use it for a variety of reasons. Firstly, a lot of them are coming, as I've said, from places of deprivation. They're not that clean. It means we haven't got to worry about delousing them or anything like that. We can just put all their clothes in a bag and stick them in the Queen's warehouse and put them in one of these. A lot more hygienic. But also, if they are trying to do what Wimberley was doing, remember I was saying Wimberley had passed the packages and was trying to dispose of them, they won't have the opportunity to do that anymore because we're a bit cuter now. We don't have sinks. There's nowhere to hide anything in our cells. But because of that, they will try to pass them and re-swallow them. So that will give us clues. Okay. So we put them in one of those, we put them in a cell, and now we watch them 24/7. Most of the time with 2 officers, but of course if one needs to go to the toilet or needs to go and have something to eat, sometimes with just 1 officer. The case officer, the person finding them, will be the person, he will be there 16 hours a day until those packages are retrieved, and that will normally take 3 or 4 days. Remember the other day I was saying that I groaned a bit inwardly when when I thought he might be a swallower. That's because of that. 16 hours a day for the next 3 or 4 days, you're writing your life off for those 3 or 4 days. You're not going to do anything. The only positive thing about it, as far as you're concerned, is that when you go home, I think I might have said this the other day, but when you go home, your wife won't let you anywhere near the kitchen, because she knows what you've been doing. You don't have to make a cup of tea or anything like that. So you just sit and watch them through an open door. You're in a secure unit, no CCTV, nothing like that, not through that little window. Actually, on the, just to go off at a slight tangent, on the basis of that little window, the little windows you have where in the cells, you've seen them on the television, I'm sure you look through them. When we moved into Terminal 4, they were designing our accommodation. They did something quite unusual for the civil service. They actually asked us, the officers, what we needed. They didn't do that very often. They normally asked the managers. And we said, well, we must have viewing windows, one-way glass. We must have viewing windows. The first time we used those cells in Terminal 4, just a normal type smuggler, the officer gets him, puts him in there, locks it all up, opens up the little viewing window, and he's looking straight at himself. Because BAA, bless them, yes, they've put one-way glass in, but they've put it the wrong way round. And they can see us and we can't see them. So, yeah, bless them. But you can't do that. You watch them through an open door. Because, for one thing, if they are wriggling around and maybe trying to pass those drugs, you will observe it through an open door. But also, health and safety-wise. In that year when we had 730 swallowers, 3 of them died because of packages unraveling inside them. But if we hadn't watched them through an open door, in that same year, over 20 people, we had to call the paramedics because officers were worried that they were becoming distressed. And through an open door, you pick up on that. On a CCTV, you don't, or through a window. But our officers must have saved at least 20 people's lives just because of being observant through an open door. And then you wait. You wait for nature. We used to feed them not special foods. I don't mean laxatives or anything. But if they came from West Africa, the custody officers used to actually cook appropriate food for them to try and get everything flowing, or Trinidadian pepper pots, or whatever, jerk chicken, just to get them eating. We were stopped from doing it by the health and safety executive because they said, no, you can't, because where those foods are being actually prepared in the officers' own homes, we can't vouch for the hygiene. I was involved with the negotiations. It was like sort of trying to, it was actually like, the lunatics are running the asylum, because these people have got instant death inside them, and we're trying to feed them to get that out of them, and they're telling us they might get a stomach bug, so we can't do it. Absolutely incredible. But now we wait, and eventually they will say, yes, I need to go to the toilet. So we put them on one of these. It's called a frost machine. It's not cold, but they're the people who make it. I've got a few more pictures. This is best picture of all. They sit there. One officer sits here, stands and watches, because you still don't know what they might get up to. And the other one is round the back here, and everything comes down here, out here, and you've got really big, thick rubber gloves, and you knock the packages into some disinfectant, and they end up in one of those little glass jars that those white packages were in just now. And you're masked up and everything, and it's relatively hygienic. It's not nice, but it's just something you have to do. And that's what we do till we're pretty happy that we've got them all. They do have 2 clear motions before we allow them to go, because what they will do is sometimes they'll have 350 packages. They'll swallow 300, then they'll have a pause, maybe for 12 hours, and then they'll swallow another 50. But they'll only admit to 300 packages. Very rarely you can actually count the packages. I'm going to show you one in a minute where you can do that. So they'll hope that after we've got the 300, we'll say, oh, okay, off you go, and we'll put them in. They'll go to prison. They've got another 50 packages that they can use as currency in prison. So we are a bit wise to that. We wait for 2 clear motions. We've got another picture of a frost machine. Now, of course, before, when we got Wimberley and White and the early ones, we didn't have a frost machine. It wasn't a matter of one of the senior officers saying, oh, Malcolm, pop down to Hounslow High Street and get us a frost machine from the frost machine shop. No, in our very early days, it was a bit more basic than that. We sat them on a portaloo. We took the package out of the portaloo. We then emptied the package into a colander, went into what we laughingly called our laboratory, where we had a hairspray thing, and we sprayed away till all that was left was the packages. For whatever reason, I don't know whether they had a contract for this or not, the colanders were always plastic cream-coloured. I cannot have a cream-coloured plastic colander in our house to this day. And Cunard tell me that if any of you have, they will recompense you to buy a new one, okay, if it's put you off. But of course, although I was saying White and Wimberley, when we actually got the very first 3 or 4, we didn't even have a colander and a portaloo. Why would you need a portaloo just hanging around? So the very first few was even more basic than that. You needed officers with good eye-arm coordination. Because we had to use one of these. I'm not going to get too graphic because I know you haven't had lunch. But we used to have very thick plastic bags that we used for bundling up the drugs to stop the smell emanating everywhere. Otherwise, we'd have been high as kites all the time. So these very thick bags, you put them in a waste bin and you made the person crouch and pass. Then you took that bag, and you needed 3 officers for this. You've got the man with the bag with the drugs in. You've got another officer, with another bag. And in between, you've got an officer with a coat hanger that's been squashed flat. The man with the drugs in the bag rolls the bag up, if you can picture this, till everything comes to the top. At which point, the man with the coat hanger puts the coat hanger underneath the packages, one at a time, and flicks them from that bag to that bag. That's where the eye-arm coordination comes in. You know, you don't want an officer who keeps missing them, you know, so like that. I know people will say, nah, that can't be true. But I would ask you, just think, how else were we going to do it? You know, if you actually think about it, you've got a really incredible problem at this point, and that's what we had to do. Yeah, officers became really good at all of that. Do you know, you go around the country, don't you? I go around the country a lot doing talks, and I see, you know, there's going to be a village fete here or whatever, you know. And I often think, you know, at a village fete, that game would make a fortune, wouldn't it? Hey, that would be a good game. That's a good game. Anyway, let me move on, because I've got a feeling I've run out of time. I shouldn't normally run out of time. Just a quick couple of case studies. James Harris. This was a very bog-standard type of case, and I use this one because he was so typical. He's coming in, as I say, he was typical. He didn't fit the profile because he had more baggage than he would normally have. He was very unlucky. The green channel came to a full stop, just came to a full stop. And it does that sometimes, just like motorways do, you know, just density of traffic, don't they, the motorway, and you don't know why, and there's never any reason. The green channel was like that. Harris was about 4 feet away from me in front of him. Didn't fit the profile because he had checked in baggage, and he looked reasonable. He didn't look like he came from the slums of Kingston, which is where he did come from. So he stood there. Now, people will stand there. They come with their trolleys, they stand there, and it stops. And they're a bit confused, but for a little while, they just stand there. And then they get a bit fidgety, and they start looking, just like we do in our cars on the motorway, don't we? We wonder what's going on. And everybody else is doing that. But Harris is focusing on the back of the neck of the person in front of him, and he is not flinching. And now I notice this, and now I'm watching him. They're probably only there about 90 seconds, minute and a half, 2 minutes at the most. But he does not budge, and that isn't normal. So I call him over, I bring him over to the bench. He's very calm. He's coming over here for his aunt's wedding. He's not seen this aunt in over 20 years. He's not sure where she lives, but he believes it's Brixton. He's not sure if anybody's picking him up. He's got no means of contacting anybody after we rub him down and everything. He's got no telephone numbers. It's all Jackanory. He's got no clothes in there suitable for a wedding, but that doesn't really count. But he's got no money on him. It just doesn't add up. And then I look at his ticket, and it's that cash paid ticket, as I was telling you the other day. It's cash paid. But more relevant, he's a carpenter in Kingston. Now, you as an officer know what a carpenter in Kingston would earn, or in Bogota, or a plumber, or what. You've got an idea of the annual wages. His ticket is about a third of his annual wages. It's an open-ended ticket as well, which means as soon as he's got rid of his packages, he'll go straight home again. Now, he's spending a third of his annual wages to come over to the wedding of an aunt who he hasn't seen for 20 years and who he doesn't actually know where she lives. Now, that is the sort of story that immediately makes me think I need to talk to you in private. And that's a very, very typical sort of case. But the next one is a little less typical, and this is Gary the Texan. Gary the Texan, wrong on the flight. Remember back to my first talk? People look wrong on the flight. He's on a red-eye flight from the eastern seaboard of America. They're called red-eyes because they go overnight, and they're all businessmen, and they're either red-eyed because they've lost a night's sleep or because they've drunk too much on the way over. But they're called red-eyes. The seats on those flights are more expensive than normal economy seats because the airlines know that they're nearly all businessmen. So Gary's coming through amidst all these businessmen. Now, I can't actually paint you a picture of Gary, but if I gave you all a pencil and paper and said, draw me a hippie from the 70s, you would draw something very similar to Gary. Ponytail, beard, guitar, the lot. He just stands out like a sore thumb. But no, he's coming over here. He hasn't got anything to declare. He's done a bit of ganja, so we do a urine test. But yeah, I've done a bit of ganja. That's why there's cannabis in my urine. But eventually we take him and we actually X-ray him. And the reason I use Gary is because he had 30 packages of cannabis inside him. I mean, what lunacy is that, to risk your life for 30 packages of cannabis? And the good thing about it was at the time was when we actually got the X-ray, we could actually count. We could actually see 30 packages. And that's unique. I don't ever remember coming up against that again. We had Gary 7 days. The packages didn't pass. When we'd eventually charged him, we'd got the 30 packages. I asked him why. Off record, why? Why did it take 7 days? Wondering if he'd taken something that had slowed the process down. Because we were learning. You know, this was early days. I think Gary was on one of the ones on a Portaloo in the calendar. So it wasn't very early, but it was early. And we were learning. And he says to me, and it's so funny, because you become, you know, I've been with him 16 hours a day for 7 days. We're not just on first name terms, we're on nickname terms. And he's calling me Mal. And he says, well, he says, Mal, he says, it's like this. We's just about to land. As we's just about to land, I can feel those packages. These welling up inside me. And so I undoes my belt. I makes a dash for the can. As soon as I'm in there and I've shut the door, everybody's banging on the door. You got to get out of there. Well, they're still welling up. So I just don't know what to do. So in the end, I put the stopper in the sink. I bring them all up. They're still banging. So I think, well, I'll just swallow them again. Yeah, it was just like just before my lunch. I said, well, thank you for that, Gary. But why we had miscalculated was, of course, we were thinking that he'd, for one, swallowed them at least 24 hours earlier. And two, of course, his stomach was going through tremendous trauma. Just to finish off, because this was a major problem, just to show you how we got round it. Operation Airbridge came in. I'll just explain that. In the worst year, or the best year, depending on how you look at it, 730 swallowers at Heathrow and Gatwick. But people watching them, 2 officers, 3 shifts every day, so 6 officers a day. And you work it all out, comes to 72 staff years. So we were using 72 officers to really deal with relatively small amounts of drugs. Say 730, even if they've all got a kilo, that's only 730 kilos. You know, one person with 2 hard-sided suitcases, 20 kilos. An officer's with them for about 6 hours and it's all done and dusted. So this was not good sense. The next year, 2003, 185. Why? Because this man, John White, my governor, wasn't a very popular governor, and he wasn't the best governor I ever had, but he was very brave. And he decided that he would go out to all the different embassies where these swallowers were coming from, and it was mainly Bogota, Kingston, Accra, and Lagos at the time, and seek their help for us to put officers out there to do that EMIT test, that urine test, before they left. And everybody told him he was wasting his time. Everybody. But the Jamaicans, the Jamaican government took him up on it. And that's why we put our people out there, and that's why that figure dropped so dramatically in 1 year, because an awful lot of those swallowers that would have been coming over here were detained before they even got on the flight. So we should also say a big thank you to John White, because he has saved us an absolute fortune in wasted wages. And that's the end of part 3. I'm going to be back on Sunday the 29th, part 4, Lies and Excuses. Before you all groan, it is not a political broadcast. It's nothing to do with the election. Okay? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, hold on. As Amanda said, I will be up at the bookshop if anybody does want to read my book, or buy it, rather. Okay, thank you very much.